The hammer fell like a verdict. Dust rose in lazy clouds, horseflies swarmed, and for a heartbeat the market quieted as people turned away from the platform. She paid 10 cents for a living body that held 2 lives inside it, one already grown into courage and fear, the other small and nameless, only beginning to arrive. The Countess wrapped her gloved fingers around the coin as if it were a treaty, and the young woman, bending under the weight of herself and the gaze of strangers, was handed over like a trunk of used linens. No one asked whether mercy or calculation had drawn the Countess into that crowd. The whispering hand of society would prefer the question remain unanswered. The Countess was called Eulália by those who still bowed. Her widow's veil had been barely threadbare when she returned from the city with the girl tucked beneath her arm. The estate, whitewashed, broad-roofed, and ringed with cane, had suffered more than the Countess let on. The commendador, her late husband, had been prodigal with titles and deaths alike. Rumor said the papers that kept their world together were thin as tissue, mortgages, pledges, and kin who smelled weakness like hounds. Eulália's plan was a machine of hush and paper. If a child could be made to appear as the commendador's blood, then the line of succession might be redirected. A child would stop the claims, quiet the cousins who sniffed inheritance like carrion, and perhaps, in time, heal the estate's fissures. Mariana had been purchased for a pittance and brought to the house of the Countess. She carried in her shoulders the slow, remembered cruelty of the market, and in her belly a name she did not yet speak. She had known the commendador, how could she not? One of the many hands that had used the power of his station. There had been promises, perhaps, and there had been force. She had been left with the trace of something permanent and a knot of shame the world could not unmake. To the Countess, though, that knot was currency. At the back of the great house, rooms smelled of lemon oil and old tobacco. The Countess's room looked out over the coffee terraces. It suggested order. The room where Mariana slept was behind the kitchen, near the churn and the woodpile, close enough for the housekeeper to glance at night and see there were no signs of freedom. When Eulália guided her into the house for the first time, she spoke with soft authority and the thin apology of one used to getting what she wanted by folding people into a story as if they were props. "You will what I ask," the Countess said, and her voice offered kindness like a ledger entry, measured, valuable, necessary. Mariana heard the plan before it was called by name. She heard hushed conversations at dusk while servants cleared plates and the Countess poured brandy that hid like sun in the glass. A scribe or escrivan from the town had been paid to look at records. A midwife from a neighboring parish had been persuaded to witness a baptism whose godparents would be the Countess and a trusted neighbor. There were bribes that could rewrite a signature's curve, favors that could make a neighbor's testimony lean the way Eulália needed. The Countess's fingers moved over these men like a seamstress smoothing fabric. She stitched a plot by touch. Why would anyone believe such a contrivance? Because the commendador had been indiscreet. Because families in debt long for certainty. Because people prefer to believe that the lonely woman at the heart of the house kept watch over a faithful heart. And because, mostly, the town needed a new story to settle upon. But for all her smooth maneuvers, the Countess underestimated one thing: the stubbornness of those who have nothing left to lose. Mariana was not a mute instrument. The enslaved women of the back house talked in low voices by the well and in the night by the hammocks. They told each other names of their children, secrets about medicines, and whispered about justice in ways that were half prayer and half strategy. Ariana, the older woman who had delivered children for decades, was a quiet presence with hands that had learned to mend both cloth and body. She watched Mariana with an affection that was not sentimental, but careful. She had seen schemes that promised protection and then swallowed the women whole. The Countess kept Mariana close. She spoke to her in the early mornings when the house was only waking, instructing how the baptism should be framed, what the child should be named, how the child should someday sit in the chair that had belonged to the Commendador. She taught Mariana to curtsy at the right angle, to keep her eyes from lowering too suddenly in the presence of guests who might speak on behalf of the family's claim. It was a strange training. The Countess asked the young woman to perform loyalty while she planned to use the child's very body as leverage. The cousins circled. Two of them, Ottavio and his brother, men named for the old money in their veins, were loud and blunt. They smelled the Countess's scheme and threatened the estate with the only language they thought would bite: litigation and public disdain. "You mean to name a child of no lineage as heir?" Ottavio spat one afternoon, the wine on his breath making his words rough. "Do you think papers can patch the shame?" The word shame pooled in the house like a slow collecting rain. Eulália answered with cool measures: more gifts at Mass, a planted witness here, a count signed there, and she smiled the smiles of a woman who had spent her life converting moral currency into legal currency. Outside, gardeners trimmed the hedges, and the river shimmered like a mirror that refused to show what it contained. Still, within the heart of domestic life, other forces stirred. Mariana found small acts of resistance. She learned where the fruit hung soft and how to hide bread beneath the coals. She sang songs to the child within her, lullabies that pried open the space between pain and hope. She talked with Ariana about names and futures. Ariana told stories about children who made their own destinies, and Mariana listened with a hunger that did not fit the Countess's neat plans. Rumors began to thread through the town. A child born upon Eulália's claim would change everything. What the whispers did not say out loud was who would profit when a child was declared legitimate. The cousins watched, and creditors sharpened their pens. The estate needed certainty like a wound needs dressing. Otherwise, the town's market would freeze, buyers would hesitate, and the price of coffee and sugar would slide like slipping coins down a gutter. At nights, when wind came off the river and the servants burned citronella to keep mosquitoes at bay, the Countess worked on papers. She had her man in the municipal office. An escrivain, uncomfortable with his own conscience, had been offered money and the promise of a connection to a household that could reward him in due course. He wrote dates that suited Eulália. He turned signatures into suggestions. And yet, under the bramble of lies, a single detail could unravel a seam that had seemed secure. People remember what they think they have forgotten. A neighbor across the lane had, years ago, seen the Commendador's figure leaning near the sugar mill at dusk, and he had remembered the face that peered at him from between the cane. Another had kept a letter for a while, a scrap of a promise that had gone unread. Memory is a dangerous thing because it is porous. It keeps what it wants to and leaks what will undo you. Many hooks of fate clustered. A child's face, when at last the hour came, would be a silent judge. A careless word in a tavern could be a torch at a dry thatched roof. The Countess, for all her craft, had to account for human fallibility. Her plan relied on paper and silence. Those two commodities are never as durable as one hopes. As the months wound toward the birth, the house took on the smell of preparation. Bundles of clean cloth, jars of herbs, the metallic scent of a lamp's oil. Mariana rested as she could. The presence of Eulália hovered like a careful guest in the room, sometimes touching the edge of a blanket as if to smooth an invisible crease. The child moved with a rhythm that Mariana came to know as their small defiance. In the night, she would press a hand and whisper promises she did not know whether to keep. The day of the birth arrived as if it had been rehearsed. Thunder walked in the distance, and the sky was the color of iron. The room where Mariana labored was small and hot, the lamplight drowsy and yellow. Rather than the elegant chamber Eulalia favored, the birth took place in the servants' quarters. The plan required that witnesses be near but not intrusive. Ariana worked as she always did, steady, hands remembering the exact point a life is coaxed from one world into another. Other women gathered with the pragmatic hush of those accustomed to noise. A coil of rope, a bowl of hot water, a cloth to catch the first breath. Labor is not only flesh. It is a place where secrets tremble. The Countess sat outside the doorway like a judge listening for a verdict. She had arranged for the midwife who would vouch for the baptism, for the godmother who would sign her name in the baptismal book. She had arranged for the papers and the angle of light in which a visitor might see the child and decide on the honesty of the claim. Control, she had learned, is the art of preparing steps. But the last moments refused to be staged. When the child came, a cry split the room. First a small, urgent sound, then a chorus as the women coaxed, then the thin, new wail that belongs only to those who have never tasted the air. For an instant, the Countess saw in the infant what she had spent months fashioning in her mind, a future anchored to her household. She reached forward, touching the child with the formal affection of someone already naming a destiny. But human beings are not blank ledgers, and the infant's face, pale and veined with the shape of night, carried a resemblance that startled more than anyone expected. The child's eyes, large and dark, held the same restless flattening of features the Commendadore's own nieces had described. The curve of an ear, the set of the chin, small points, but to a gossiping town they become signposts. That night, as the house breathed and the rain pried at gutters, questions began to unroll like thread. A neighbor who worked at the mill had been pressed into service on the night of the birth to carry wood. He had also been one of the rare men who had seen the Commendadore's face in a long-ago moonlight. He hesitated at the doorway when he glimpsed the child, and, though he said nothing at the time, his presence would later harden into testimony. Eulalia's confidence did not break then. She was practiced at wronging the world without flinching. She had prepared a baptismal certificate with a godfather who would swear the child had been born under the Commendadore's roof. The escrivain's hand had been deft. A signature had been altered to fit the story. The Countess held the infant for photographs that would be shown as evidence, for a portrait to be painted, where the child would sit between the mantles of both families, binding what paper could not. Yet, even carefully placed lies accumulate small debts to the truth. The escrivain, who had once taken a folded purse from Eulalia, began to sleep badly. Coins cannot buy off the hearing of a troubled conscience. He had done the math, and had told himself the money would be a bridge to a new life, but the memory of his own sister, sold many years before, and gone, stayed with him like a stain. In a council of small rebellions, he did what small guilty men do. He began to keep receipts that contradicted his ledger, and to write marginal notes that might be read as prescient when the right eyes landed upon them. The cousins smelled blood. Rumors swelled into claims. They called for an inventory without witnessing the entire truth. They demanded inspections, questioned baptisms, and leaned on the town's sympathy. They knew, coldly, how reputations crumble. A rumor, a witness, a document out of place. The Countess answered by tightening her circle. She summoned friends to swear that the commendador had been kind to women, that he had once ruefully spoken of a child he might have had, that he had shown a generosity of spirit that would not be denied. The town, for its own part, enjoyed the spectacle of high people arguing over low things. Men at the tavern drew the sides like chess pieces. Old debts that had been finessed were now called in. Buyers who had once bought coffee from the estate began to pause at the Countess's gate. Their ledgers, once willing, now showed the sharp red of worry. Money is a gossiping thing. It withdraws when reputations are brittle. Several weeks after the birth, the escrivain's conscience finally cracked. He came to the house under the cover of dusk, hands shaking. He had a letter and a confession he could not keep from himself. The Countess met him in the parlor, where the long curtains made the room a place of dusk-lit secrecy. When she saw him approach, she offered a smile that was a hinge for doors. He spoke in a voice thin with the age of his lies, and withdrew a paper from his coat. "What do you have?" Eulália asked, her voice small as a ledger. The escrivain placed the paper on the table and pushed it toward her. It was a ledger entry, one of many, where his ink had been honest before he had learned to lie. He told her in a stammer that he had kept a marginal note, a witness's name that his official handwriting had tried to erase, a ragged hand that remembered the commendador's private entanglement with a woman in another parish. He had also written, late at night after the Countess paid him, that to forge such documents is to break an order the town keeps, and that the debt of such an act is not only legal but moral. Eulália's eyes narrowed like shutters closing. This paper was a splinter under the skin. She could have paid him to retract. She could have bribed the man's silence with more gold. Instead, she did what many would do whose backs are pressed to the old walls of shame. She sought to control the narrative by more control. She promised favor in return for discretion. She offered a small house in town. She hinted at a place in the household where the escrivain's children might one day find work. But favors cost, and the escrivain would not be content with tokens. He wanted absolution in the coin of truth. He wanted to set right the ledger of his life. He threatened quietly. If his marginalia were discarded, he would carry that knowledge to those who would challenge the Countess openly, men who had nothing to lose. That threat became a match. Ottavio and his brother were men who would not stand to see the line broken. They had already been working the town halls, whispering to merchants and to the vicar, threatening action. When the escrivain's note leaked, somehow a pocket burned by beer and bad conscience, an uproar began. The cousins triggered a formal contestation. They called upon neighbors to verify what they had seen years ago. A neighbor stepped forward, trembling as if he bore the hurt of years, and said he had indeed seen the commendador with another woman, but not in the way that would make a child legitimate. Another voice, quieter, said that the commendador had fathered none in public recognition. The law, when called upon by those with means, moves like a machine whose gears are lubricated by power. Papers were filed, and though the specifics of how the estate could be rerouted under law were uncertain and, in some measures, indefinido, what unfolded in practice was not. Reputations were dragged through mud, creditors grew cold, and the market's tolerance for scandal had its limits. People who had once courted the Countess began to distance themselves. Invitations stopped coming. Allies withdrew their support with the prudent cruelty of those who believe that to be safe you must look away from those who trouble peace. The Countess's network thinned. The estate's debts, once manageable, became a hollow rod. Without welcome credit, the plantations began to wither under a different weight: absence. Workers refused to stay where they felt the walls crumbling. Buyers, suspicious and influenced by the cousins' whispers, offered lower and lower prices for the crop. The coffers that once sounded like authority now sounded hollow. The Countess had attempted to spin one secret into security and instead spun it into a noose. Devastation arrived by increments. The sugar ovens cooled for lack of fuel. The coffee terraces were left half-harvested as laborers walked away toward places where the price of their work was not paid in rumor and threat. The servants' quarters held their breath. The patterns of life disrupted as creditors demanded payments the estate could no longer meet. Men came to the gate with papers. Horses were saddled for auctions that might be held if the Countess could not reconcile ledgers. Piles of accounts were posted in the town as public display. The family's private shame became the town's currency. The Countess, who had believed herself the author of fate, found herself in the role of a character who had believed illusions. She watched as alliances collapsed into silence. Friends who once bowed now diverted their eyes. The cousins smiled with the slow triumph of men who had read the playbook of familial ruin. Even those who had eaten at her table and taken her hospitality turned away. The house that had seemed like a fortress was exposed. Mortgaged land, falling income, a staff that dwindled, and the prying eyes of neighbors eager for spectacle. There were other costs less visible on paper. The scandal gnawed at the moral fabric of the house. People who had been bought and sold had always known how to carry the weight of impossible situations, but even they could not remain blind to the way humiliation spread. Mariana watched the Countess shrink before the world she had so carefully arranged. The child, whose first cries had been the hope and plan of the Countess, became a symbol that escaped her keeper's clasp. Where the Countess had intended obedience, the child's presence instead drew men and women into questions about power and who gets to declare what is true. One night, when the rain hammered the corrugated roof and the house knew sleeplessness, a group of the enslaved workers gathered in the pale light of the servants' quarters. They spoke in low, urgent voices about what the scandal meant for them. Freedom, they had long understood, is not only a legal status, it is also the ability to refuse being used as an instrument. They remembered mothers who had been separated for money. They recalled the faces of children sold across rivers. The Countess's attempt at securing an heir was another knot in a long chain of injury. Among them rose the thought, quiet at first and then bolder, why continue to labor for a house whose foundation was built on lies and the flesh of others? Such thinking was not a novel force, only rarely expressed. But when laborers choose to leave, a plantation loses more than hands. It loses the rhythm by which the coffee and sugar are tended. No forgery is so powerful that it can command the loyalty that trust buys. Workers left in small groups, then in larger ones. The house could not find enough men to bring in the harvest. Buyers, noting the patchy yield and the risk the scandal posed to their own reputations, moved away. In time, the creditors who had once extended the Countess wine on credit withdrew their protection. The bank, cautious and faceless, put pressure that could not be eased with smiles. Lawyers, hired by cousins with steadier claims to the estate, filed for sale. The world that had been secured with a child's potential inheritance dissolved into auctions and notices nailed to the gate. When the sheriff came with a paper to attach to the great doors, the Countess stood as she had in portraits, still and composed, but in her eyes there was a hardness that was not pride, but the grinding of realization. All the careful machinations, the bribed hand of the escrivant, the baptized certificate, the portraits, the gifts, none of it could rebuild the social capital the family had lost. The town preferred certainty. It preferred to move wealth toward those it thought clean of scandal. The Countess's secret, once exposed, had repelled the very institutions she had sought to command. The estate was sold in parcels after a tedious public auction. Buyers from further afield kept their distance, but the cousins took what they could, and men who had owed men sacks of coffee found ways to buy small holdings, eager to turn the fallen family's property into profit. The house that had loomed like a promise became a hull of memory. The Countess's name, once pronounced with a hush of respect, was now a syllable of complaint. And yet, devastation is not only material. The social ruin had human faces left scattered at the margins. The Countess watched as those she had used quietly stepped into lives that were their own. Mariana, with the child on her hip, did not cling to the house that had attempted to make her a vessel. Ariana helped her gather a few blankets, a coin hidden in a hem, and the courage to walk away. They left at dawn, passing the gate before its guards understood their absence, because guards were busy collecting their wages and packing necessities for a household that no longer seemed certain to them. Mariana's future was uncertain. The law, the town, and rumor could not have her erased now. The child existed and had a story of birth and survival. Some possibilities opened: escape to a river port where new work might be found, the hope of freedom someday when social tides shifted, the chance that the scandal could be turned not into erasure but into a claim for release. Whether she would be free in law remained indefinito in the documents of men who had always decided such things in their own time. But in the small ledger of human life, she had agency where once she had been a line item. Eulalia remained in the old house for a short while longer. She was the last of the many who had thought paper could substitute for affection. She watched her chair sit empty at meals and felt the loneliness of a woman who had placed her security in a future that was itself not organic. She had purchased a child with the calculation of a banker and discovered that such commodity has its own will. Her wealth unraveled into scandal and paper, and in the end there were fewer people who would speak kindly of her. She had not been punished by law, at least not in a manner that can be safely asserted here as definitive, but she was punished by the social forces she had tried to master: isolation, the loss of staff, the public sales of lands. Whether humiliation equaled justice is another measure. What is clear is that her plan, designed to consolidate power, had instead been the instrument of the estate's ruin. In the months that followed, outside the broken gates of the old estate, a child learned the names of birds and the exact season for planting a bean. Mariana, who had walked away with only a few things, an old shawl, a bowl, a song, took work where she could. Ariana found her a place in a kitchen at a modest inn near the river. The child grew under a sky that did not know the distinctions of rank. In a small, spare way, that life became a quiet repudiation of the Countess's ambition. It proved that a human being's worth is not a line item to be bought and sold. What follows from such tales is never simple. The estate was left in ruin. Plantations were parceled, houses sold, and creditors took what advantage they could. A once mighty family became a cautionary tale in the town's tavern whisperings. The Countess learned the isolation that comes when society turns away. Mariana found, in the small kindnesses of other women and the slow rhythm of work, a kind of recovery that no document could grant. Yet one other thing mattered. Truth, once let loose, has a way of redistributing power. The escrivain who had confessed found his own life altered as well, ostracized in a town that distrusts truth-tellers even as it revels in scandal. The cousins, though they gained ground during the frenzy, found that profit bought in the moment of another's fall often carries the sour aftertaste of guilt. The laborers who left seeded more than fields. They carried knowledge of their worth into new places. Out of devastation grew seeds for a different accounting of power. Years later, at a small table in a modest inn, a man who once worked in the mill told a young boy about a child whose eyes had been said to belong to a commendador. The boy listened, grave, and the story did what such stories must do. It became a caution, a teaching. He would grow up knowing that a secret built on pain cannot lie hidden indefinitely. The town's memory held the tale like a stone in a stream, smoothed, carried onward, always reshaping the bank. There is a stubborn moral that threads this history and that the Countess could not foresee. A life cannot be owned entirely, and the more one tries to cage another person in order to secure one's own position, the greater the chance that the cage will break under the sheer pressure of living. Eulália thought herself a steward of legacy. Instead, she discovered that legacy cannot be bought with a coin and sealed with an altered signature. The secret she buried did not stay beneath the floorboards. It surfaced, as secrets do, and in doing so brought the world she had tried to hold together to pieces. Mariana's child, in the end, carried a different inheritance, a name kept not by papers alone, but by the stories of those who survived. Whether that life would be granted formal freedom by the law of the town was a question left open by men whose decisions always bend toward their own interests. But the child would grow not as a pawn in a ledger, but as a person whose existence stubbornly refused to be footnote to another's ambition. So it was that the Countess, who had paid 10 cents for a pregnant young woman, found the cost far greater than any coin could measure. The farm, once a symbol of her family's permanence, lay wrecked in the wake of a plot that had intended to bind everything in place. Instead, it unbound it. The devastation was both material and reputational, a slow ruination born of the attempt to turn a human life into a safeguard. The small life that had been at the heart of Eulália's design became, by living, the instrument that dissolved her plan. If there is a final quiet, it is not entirely bleak. In the wake of ruin, new ties form. Those who once suffered in silence learned the force of speaking. Those who once bowed found ways to claim their steps. The child, with a name whispered in kitchens and on riverbanks, grew in a world less gilded but more honest, threaded not by the Countess's ledger, but by the hands that had raised him and the stories that had kept him. What would you have done with the chance to secure a legacy? What would you trade to keep a house intact? The Countess chose calculation. Mariana chose life. The ledger of history keeps both, but not in equal measure. One paid 10 cents for a secret. The secret cost her everything. If this story reached you and made you think about how the past shapes who we are, how power is claimed, and how people endure, consider sharing it. Stories like this survive because we speak of them, and in speaking, we remember.